Hezekiah's story is a powerful account of faith, courage, and humanity. He was a king of Judah who faced immense challenges, from the threat of an invincible army to a deadly disease that nearly led to his death. In the midst of it all, his trust in God shone like a beacon, showing that true strength is not in weapons or riches, but in a heart given to the Lord. However, like every human being, Hezekiah also had his moments of weakness, leaving us precious lessons about humility and the importance of remaining faithful in all circumstances. This is a story about crises, miracles, and choices that continue to inspire generations. Subscribe to the channel for more exciting biblical stories and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any videos. If you like the content, don't forget to send a thanks a lot. And if you want to support the channel even more, become a member and gain access to exclusive benefits. Hezekiah was born at a time when darkness seemed to have covered Judah. His father, King Ahaz, had completely abandoned the ways of God, giving the people over to idolatry and closing the doors of the temple as if he wanted to erase the divine presence from the history of the world. Kingdom. In the streets, altars to foreign gods multiplied, and the despair was almost palpable. The glory that had once shone upon God's people seemed but a distant memory. But there, in the palace, something different began to emerge. Hezekiah grew up watching his father's decline closely, but also listening to the stories of the great kings who came before him. David, the shepherd who became king, and Solomon, whose wisdom built the temple. There was something in that young man's heart that made him restless in the face of so much disorder. Even in an environment filled with spiritual darkness, Hezekiah seemed to have been shaped by a flame that the world around him could not extinguish. When the time came, at the age of 25, to assume the throne of Judah, Hezekiah did not hesitate. The young king knew he needed to change the course of the kingdom. But to do so, he needed to start from the beginning, from the foundations that had been forgotten. And so, with the determination of someone who sees the horizon beyond the storm clouds, he took the first step. He ordered the doors of the temple to be reopened, as if inviting God himself to re-enter the history of his people. Hezekiah wasted no time. As soon as he became king, he called the priests and Levites and ordered them to clean the temple, which was abandoned and full of dirt accumulated from years of neglect. It was as if the stones whispered forgotten stories of praise and glory that once filled this place. The sound of doors opening and hurried footsteps resounded through the empty hallways, bringing back a life that had long since disappeared. Hezekiah knew he needed to start from there, from the heart of Judah's faith, because without God, the people would never rise up. While the priests worked, he began to destroy everything that represented the false gods that had dominated the land. Idol altars were torn down, images were broken, and sacred poles were burned. It was as if he wanted to uproot the roots of idolatry with his own hands. Hezekiah didn't just command, he led by example, demonstrating to the people that there was no room for any other god in Judah besides the Lord. When the temple was finally cleansed, he called the people together for a Passover celebration, the likes of which no one had seen since the time of Solomon. It was a unique moment when people from all parts of Judah and even Israel came to Jerusalem. There was music, chanting, and the vibrant sound of trumpets. People cried with joy as they felt the renewed presence of God among them. Hezekiah wasn't just restoring a building, he was rekindling the faith of an entire people. While Jerusalem was experiencing the fruits of spiritual renewal led by Hezekiah, a shadow began to loom over the city. From the north, terrifying reports arrived about the advance of the Assyrian Empire. Sennacherib, the king of Assyria, was known for his cruelty. He didn't just conquer territories, he ravaged them, destroying entire cities and spreading fear like an invisible weapon. His army was like a swarm of locusts, consuming everything in its path. The strongest walls and most powerful armies were simply no match for his strength. When Sennacherib's troops arrived in the region of Judah, the climate changed. The surrounding cities began to fall one by one, like trees felled by a gale. Each defeat caused tension to rise in Jerusalem. The city, now the heartland of Judah, was the next clear target. Sennacherib sent messengers to let everyone know of his imminent arrival. They positioned themselves in front of the walls and began to proclaim their threats loud and clear so that the people could hear. The words were poisonous and filled with arrogance. "Don't be fooled by Hezekiah," they shouted. "He tells them to trust in the Lord, but look around. What god of any other nation was able to save his people from the hands of the king of Assyria? None. The same fate awaits them." Those words echoed like thunder, reaching not only the ears, but also the hearts of those behind the walls. It was impossible not to feel the weight of the threat. Hezekiah, upon hearing the threats echoing through the walls of Jerusalem, did not hesitate. He knew that this battle was bigger than any army, bigger than any human strategy. The weight of responsibility fell on his shoulders, but the king did not let himself be discouraged. He stood up with a determination that came from something much deeper, his trust in God. He took Sennacherib's letter, full of words of mockery and arrogance, and went straight to the temple. There, in front of the altar, he extended the letter as if handing an unbearable burden to someone stronger. Hezekiah prayed. It was not a prayer full of formalities or elaborate speeches. It was a prayer that came from the bottom of my heart, raw and sincere, like a son asking his father for help. He recognized the greatness of God, cried out for justice, and asked the Lord to show the world that he was the true God, capable of delivering his people. As Hezekiah prayed, a calm seemed to take over the temple. It was as if his words had reached directly to the heavenly throne. It didn't take long for the answer to come. The prophet Isaiah appeared with a clear message: "Fear not." God had heard the king's prayer. Sennacherib would not enter Jerusalem. Not even an arrow would be shot at the city. God would fight for his people. Hezekiah trusted this word. Outside, the Assyrian messengers continued to mock and spread fear, but the king remained firm. It was as if he saw something that others couldn't see. That night, while the city of Jerusalem slept, something extraordinary happened. The Assyrian army, so imposing and powerful, was camped outside, sure of their imminent victory. Torches lit the tents, soldiers talked about the attack they would carry out at dawn, and weapons were ready to be used. It was a scene of overwhelming force, like a storm about to break. But suddenly, an eerie silence began to take over the camp. Without anyone being able to predict it, an angel of the Lord descended. It came like an invisible, overwhelming wind, passing between the tents and fields, and then everything changed. When the sun rose, what was left of that great army was just a scene of death and desolation. 185,000 soldiers fell that night. There was no battle, there were no war cries, just the supernatural action of God, silent and irresistible. Upon realizing what had happened, the survivors fled, abandoning their weapons, their tents, and even their courage. Sennacherib, who until then boasted of being invincible, returned humiliated to Assyria. It was the end of the threat that hung over Jerusalem. Within the city, the news spread quickly. The people, who were filled with fear, began to praise and thank God, as they had witnessed a miracle that would be remembered for generations. Hezekiah, when he heard what God had done, did not exalt himself in his own glory. He knew that victory was not his, but God's. After such a grand victory, no one could have imagined that Hezekiah would face something even more challenging. It was not a new threat to the walls of Jerusalem, nor an enemy army marching on Judah. This time, the enemy was invisible and acted within the king's own body. Hezekiah fell seriously ill, and it was no ordinary illness. It was so serious that even the prophet Isaiah came to him with a hard-to-hear message. "Put your house in order, because you are going to die." Isaiah's words fell upon Hezekiah like a blow. This man, who had faced one of the greatest empires in the world, now found himself vulnerable, trapped by something he could not fight with the strength of his faith or with his hands. The shadow of death hung over him, but the king did not accept that fate without crying out. Turning to face the wall in his bed, he poured out his heart before God. Tears flowed from his eyes as he prayed, reminding the Lord of his faithfulness and asking for more time to live. Something extraordinary happened again. Before Isaiah even left the palace, God spoke to the prophet with a new message. He was to return and tell the king that his prayer had been heard and that his life would be extended for another 15 years. Not only that, but God would give a sign to prove to Hezekiah that he would keep his word. And then, before the king's eyes, the impossible happened. The shadow on Ahaz's sundial moved back 10 degrees. It was as if time had taken a step back, a symbol that God was in control not only of life, but also of time itself. Hezekiah rose from that illness renewed, with gratitude overflowing in his heart. Hezekiah's days were once again peaceful. The illness that had nearly taken him away now seemed a distant nightmare, and his life had been renewed by a miracle so remarkable that even the shadows obeyed God's command. Yet the human heart is often surprised by its own weaknesses, and even the most faithful of men can become distracted. It was in this peaceful setting that messengers from distant Babylon arrived at Hezekiah's palace. The Babylonians came on a diplomatic mission, bringing gifts and messages of welcome. They had heard of the king's miraculous recovery and the extraordinary sign of the sun. Curious and awed, they wanted to meet the man whose life had been touched by God. Hezekiah welcomed them with open arms, with pride and hospitality. But there was something more to that visit. Perhaps it was the praise that the emissaries brought, or perhaps Hezekiah's own pride in showing off all that he had achieved. The king opened the doors of his treasures. He showed visitors the coffers full of gold and silver, the weapons in his arsenal, and even the deposits of precious spices and oils. He didn't hide anything. With every word and gesture, he seemed to want to impress them, perhaps even prove that Judah was more than a small surviving nation. But in the heat of vanity, he forgot to give credit to the real reason for all that: God. When the visitors left, Isaiah the prophet came to meet Hezekiah. His words were as sharp as a sword blade. "What did these men see in your house?" Hezekiah explained what he had shown, but Isaiah's response was a heavy foreshadowing. He said that one day everything in the king's treasures would be taken to Babylon, and even his descendants would be taken captive. Hezekiah felt the weight of Isaiah's words echoing in his mind. The warning about Judah's dark future was like a distant cloud that he could not shake off. However, the king knew he could not turn back time or undo what he had already done. His role now was to take care of the present and ensure that the people continued to follow the path he had started, a path of fidelity and trust in God. Under his leadership, Judah experienced a time of spiritual stability that had not been seen for generations. Hezekiah did more than renovate the temple. He restored the soul of the people. He sent messengers throughout the kingdom, calling those who had strayed to return to the Lord. He destroyed remaining idols and strengthened the city walls, protecting Jerusalem from future threats. But he knew that no matter how much he could build the external defenses, the hearts of the people were the real battlefield. Hezekiah often led public celebrations where stories of God's works were told and sung, uniting the nation in praise. He understood that to keep faith alive, it was necessary to constantly remember who the true King of Israel was. His government became a symbol of hope and renewal. Many began to see in Hezekiah not just a leader, but an example of how to trust God, even in times of crisis. Still, Isaiah's words continued to hang in the air. Babylon, which now seemed so distant and friendly, would become a future danger. Hezekiah knew that Judah's destiny was intrinsically linked to his own legacy and the people's fidelity to the God who had delivered them from so many crises. Hezekiah's final years were marked by a mixture of gratitude and reflection. He had seen God perform mighty miracles, saving Jerusalem from the Assyrian army, extending his life in response to sincere prayer and renewing the faith of the people. However, as he grew older, Hezekiah began to feel the weight of time and the decisions that shaped his history and that of Judah. On his deathbed, the king could look back and see how much the kingdom had changed under his rule. The temple was restored, the people once again recognized God's sovereignty, and future generations had an example that trusting in the Lord could bring deliverance, even in the most desperate situations. But there were also the shadows of his failures. That moment of vanity before the emissaries of Babylon and the warning from the prophet Isaiah that still echoed as a reminder that human choices always carry consequences. Hezekiah was buried with honors worthy of a great king in the place reserved for the leaders of Judah. His name was marked as one of the most faithful rulers and determined to follow God's ways. Stories of his courage and confidence spread among the people, passing from generation to generation. But what he left behind was not just a memory, it was a living lesson. Hezekiah's story was not just about victories or miracles, it was about the constant struggle between depending on God and the human weaknesses that from time to time arise to test even the most faithful. As the kingdom of Judah advanced, the shadow of Babylon slowly grew on the horizon, just as Isaiah had prophesied. The people would have to decide whether to keep the flame of faith rekindled by Hezekiah alive, or whether to let the darkness of pride and disobedience take over again. After all, the stories of kings like Hezekiah are not just about the past, but about the choices we all continue to make day after day. Hezekiah's story does not end just with his death or with the glories of his reign. Like him, we live surrounded by external and internal crises, moments when we are called to choose between trusting God or giving in to fear, doubt, or pride. Hezekiah teaches us that trust in God is the strength that can turn the tide. Even when everything seems lost, he faced the mighty Assyrian army not with swords or rings, but with sincere prayer. This bold faith changed the destiny of Jerusalem and revealed that God is not indifferent to the cry of his people. He sees, he hears, and he acts. But Hezekiah was also human. He stumbled into vanity when showing his treasures to Babylon, a moment in which he forgot to point to the true owner of all things. It reminds us that even in our victories, we need to remain humble, recognizing that everything comes from God. Your failures don't erase your faith, but they show that even the best leaders, those who walk close to God, are vulnerable. This challenges us to be vigilant, as our greatest battle is often not around us, but within us. As we look at the life of Hezekiah, we learn that our prayers have power, that God is faithful to keep his promises, and that even moments of fallenness can be redeemed when we turn to him. His story is a reminder that no matter what size during the crisis, God remains in control. But it's also a warning that our choices have consequences that can shape not just our lives, but the generations that come after us. And so, like the people of Judah after his death, we are left with the question, what will we do with Hezekiah's lessons? Will we choose to trust, cry out, and remain humble before the Lord? Or will we let pride lead us astray? The decision, as always, is in our hands. If you liked Hezekiah's story and want to continue following other stories of faith and overcoming, be sure to like this video and share it with those you love. And of course, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any new content. Together, let's explore more powerful lessons from the Bible.